Yes, praise to talk. Can I just ask a question which is, I'm sure will come as meat and drink to an objectivist, is that one of the problems with people's understanding about what's happened in the financial markets over the last 18 months, 2 years, is the fact that even amongst supposedly intelligent members of the public is the ability to make abstractions and to understand cause and effect. So your point about central banks pumping the world full of cheap money, not just the Federal Reserve, but the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, which has had virtually no interest rates at all for the last 10 years, is that most people can't work out the connections, and it's not because they're stupid, it's because the narrative, to want to use a terrible new Labour expression, is that we are seeing the demise of unregulated capitalism. And of course anybody who works in financial markets will know that there's nothing unregulated about it at all. You've got Sarbanes-Oxley, you've got the European Union, you've got God knows how many regulations. Anyone who's worked in banks will tell you how regulated it is. So how do you think that the correct interpretation of events can be more effectively put across? Because if you open any mainstream newspaper or magazine or TV channel, you're the same old messages. We are seeing the demise of unregulated capitalism. It's complete rubbish, but unfortunately it's very difficult to, no one seems to be, or very few people, apart from yourselves and a few others, seem to be trying to counteract it.
Absolutely, and I think the way to counteract it is to speak up. And I think the first thing that we, before we get to any of the more complex issues, before we get to the moral issues or anything like that, the first thing we have to make, the first claim we have to make, is there is no such thing as unregulated capitalism. There is no such thing. This cannot be a failure of capitalism because capitalism isn't out there. The left has taken the word capitalism. I mean, it used to be that everybody was for capitalism. Why? Because it was this mixed economy. You could have a little bit more socialism, a little bit less socialism. But if you accepted this mixed economy as capitalism, then nobody's against it. Everybody's for it, right? Because nobody's for pure socialism. And if the mixed economy is capitalism, Clinton was a capitalist, Obama would say he's pro-capitalism. What we need is to capture what capitalism really means. So what I try to do when I go on television or when I write something is first, this is what capitalism is. Capitalism means unregulated free markets. Now, how many of you think our markets are unregulated? Nobody really thinks that. But unless it's pointed out to them, their mind doesn't go there. Because you're right, the narrative is, to use that horrible word, but the narrative is that no, this is how you're supposed to think about these things. What we need to do is change the narrative. We need to start asking questions, and you can do it by just asking questions. Where is this unregulated capitalism? Where are these unregulated banks? Do you realize how many lines of regulation there are in the U.S., bank regulation bills? That every aspect of a bank's functioning is regulated. Every aspect. From the fact that in the U.S. we have deposit insurance. Now, of course, you in the U.K. have unlimited deposit insurance. So we don't care where we put our money, which bank we put our money, because the government guarantees it all. So we don't have to think about who's safe and who's not. Make us all brain dead right off the bat. Of course, that creates huge moral hazard on the part of the bankers. The bankers, as they get into more financial distress, have a great incentive to take on more and more risk because it's not their capital, it's not their money anymore, it's depositors, and the depositors don't care because they're government guaranteed. It's a really interesting phenomenon in the U.S. that I noticed back in the 80s. In the 80s, the U.S. went through the S&L crisis, the saving and loan crisis, where these saving and loans were going bankrupt left and right. And what was fascinating is that the Wall Street Journal used to publish a little chart, which was which S&Ls around the country were offering the highest rates on accounts, on checking accounts, saving accounts, CDs, money markets. And they would see, of course, people wanted high returns, and people would send them huge quantities of money because they were offering high returns. Of course, that chart was predictive, almost at 100% of which banks were going to go bankrupt. Within 6 months, most of the ones on this chart were bankrupt. So why were people sending the money to a bankrupt institution on the verge of bankruptcy? Because we don't care, because it's all guaranteed by the government. Now, what do you think those bankers were doing when they got this money that in those days, they were paying 10, 12% on some of the money? Well, they had to now invest it in ventures that they expected to get 15, 20, 25% on. Now, what kind of ventures get those kind of returns? Well, very, very risky. I call it, they were basically buying lottery tickets with the money. And once in a while, one of these banks won the lottery, and they're the survivors. Most of them lost the money. And that's why most S&Ls went out of existence during the 1980s and early 90s. But the mechanism to make that happen is created by government. So just pointing out all these little regulatory aspects, what kind of loans bank can make, you know, the very fact that the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve set the interest rates. All of those, we just need to keep conveying this message. What failed is not capitalism. What failed is not capitalism. Even if you don't make the positive point about what really caused the crisis is the central bank, just enough to get the narrative changed. And it's going to take a lot of work because we're outnumbered. You know, we just are. And unfortunately, I've seen so many free market economists crumble with this crisis. You know, suddenly change their stripes or turn the other way. I happen to think that a big part of that is this moral uncomfortableness with the idea of capitalism that causes people to switch very quickly.